Hi all, my name is Lauren and I'm a consultant here at LYSIS. Thank you for joining us today for our next webinar in the AML and KYC Leaders series. Today we are incredibly lucky to be joined by Richard Gould, who will be giving his webinar on FATF mutual evaluations. Before we get going, I am just going to give you all a short summary of Richard's career, and then I will hand over to Richard himself for the webinar. At the end, we will be running a Q&A session. Please feel free to send in your questions either as we go or at the end of the session. You can do this through the messaging section or the specific Q&A portal, which you should be able to see at your screen. I believe for me it's at the bottom if you kind of move your mouse. Please do ask questions, certainly the more the merrier. So without further ado, Richard is an assessor for the FATF fourth round mutual evaluation reports and has a career in law enforcement, which started in the 1980s. He has worked in a range of agencies, including the UK Serious Fraud Office and the National Crime Agency. Since leaving law enforcement, he has assisted several jurisdictions with the development of their law enforcement financial crime policy, strategy, procedures, and operational activity in order to demonstrate outcomes and outputs consistent with the FATF technical and effectiveness standard. So with that, I will hand over to Richard for the main event.
Right, thank you for that, Lauren. I question whether or not you're incredibly fortunate, but we'll see how that pans out. Welcome to all. I've had a quick look at the list of people who are dialing in, so to speak, and they are literally from the 5 different corners of the planet. So hopefully this will appeal to everyone. Given the current circumstances that we all find ourselves in, and the fact that going through mutual evaluation work, which at the best of times can be boring enough to stun an ox from 500 yards, I'm going to try and keep this quite light-hearted. However, because some of it is technical, I apologise in advance if some of it does get bogged down, but I'll try and keep it light. Just a couple of things to underline. A lot of the views in this are my personal views. That will differ if I'm going into the stats or the facts that I'll lift straight out of methodology, etc. But I'll try and make clear my own opinions as opposed to the stats or facts. I'm not aiming to pick on specific jurisdictions. This isn't a hatchet job on jurisdictions and what they did or didn't do correctly. But there will be occasional times when I have to focus on a jurisdiction to illustrate a point. So apologies to anyone that is expecting me to hatchet job a particular jurisdiction, because that isn't going to happen. Overall, the aim of this is to raise the awareness across the AML KYC Leaders Network of what the FATF mutual evaluation process actually does and how it plays out, with the aim of hopefully adding to your knowledge and understanding of your everyday roles, which some people I know speaking to them outside of this network are a little bit confused about exactly what use they're supposed to make in mutual evaluations. But we'll see how we go. Right, what we're going to cover is a little bit about what FATF is. That'll be background work mostly, and it will be quick slides because most of us will be fully familiar with what FATF is. The basics of evaluation, the ratings, the initial preparation that jurisdictions need to put in. We'll talk about a bit about the on-site visits, the plenary process, the follow-up and the ICRG, and I'll detail in full what the ICRG is later on. Then we'll have a wrap-up and a quick discussion about whether it's all worth it. So what is the FATF? Right? And this is going to be one of the quick slides. Created in 1989 following the G7 summit in Paris, intergovernmental body that sets the international standards for money laundering, financing of terrorism, and proliferation finance. The first set of recommendations issued in April 1990, solely to combat money laundering. These were added to in 2001 with the +9 recommendations detailing about terrorist financing. These were all amalgamated in 2012 for one set of recommendations that applied to both terrorist financing and combating money laundering. The interesting thing is the 2012 recommendations also incorporated some measures to do with proliferation finance, which previously didn't have their own standalone measures. Each of the standards are regularly updated, the methodology is updated. For example, in June 2019, notes relating to virtual assets were added, and many of the regulations and recommendations have footnotes or explanatory notes. For example, recommendation 29, which is all about financial intelligence units, has a couple of notes about the material used by a financial intelligence unit, and also about the various models that could be adopted, because not every jurisdiction chooses to adopt the same absolutely adherent model that the FATF recommendation suggests. So moving on from that, how does it operate? Consists of 39 members, that's 37 separate jurisdictions and 2 organisations, which are the Gulf Cooperation Council and the European Commission. Those 2 don't actually have what you might call voting rights at the plenary, but they're there as full members, can speak as full members, but don't actually hold sway over anything that we'll discuss later on. There are 9 FATF regional style bodies. FATF itself is not able to actually deliver globally because, as it says there, 200 plus jurisdictions who are committed to the standards. It would be technically impossible for one body to oversee this. So there's 9 regional style bodies which are like microcosms of the main FATF, and they cover jurisdictional areas. So there's one for South America, there's one for what effectively is Central Europe, there's one for the Middle East and North Africa, etc. They all work together, and it's by that method that they actually assist in delivering the standards across the planet. The implementation of the recommendations, there's peer reviews carried out. I'll say this a couple of times during the presentation just so it's rammed home. The peer reviews are by the members, not by the FATF Secretariat. Now, obviously the FATF Secretariat has a huge role to play in it, which I'll explain to some extent later on, but it is important to remember it's peer review. So it's the individuals that are put forward by the different jurisdictions as members of either FATF itself or the regional style bodies, depending on which country is being subject to an evaluation, that conduct the actual evaluation itself. There's been a number of questions about whether or not FATF or the regional style FATF body secretariat have been steering too much and not allowing the peer reviewers to actually do the review. But that has been one of the problems historically, and I will touch on that in a slide or two. So in all, they're mutual evaluations. Everyone peer reviews everyone else, in theory. The basics. An evaluation should take place every 5 years or so. There's a little star there, because if you look at the footnote of the slide, this includes the short form assessment that happens 5 years after an evaluation report. And it's at that point that various mechanisms are triggered to make sure that re-ratings for effectiveness and technical compliance, both of which we'll get onto in a second, are fully addressed. The current round's the 4th round. That's the 4th round of mutual evaluations across the community. And as time goes by, the community is getting bigger, so there's more and more time taking up on these mutual evaluation reports. To date, there's over 100 in the 4th round that have been conducted. That's across FATF itself, as well as the regional style bodies. The 4th round introduces the effectiveness in addition to the compliance with the recommendations. It can't really be undersold, or sorry, oversold, right? The component of effectiveness. This comes as a result of looking back in time on those who had passed, I say passed, undertaking the mutual reviews for the previous rounds and had really good ratings on all their technical compliance. So for example, a jurisdiction may have absolutely hard and fast anti-money laundering laws, which were clear, they were decisive, they had huge penalties, they were considered the gold standard globally. However, when you actually looked at what the jurisdiction was doing, they hadn't prosecuted anyone. And it doesn't matter how good your law is, if you don't prosecute anyone with it, I would suggest it's not a very good deterrent. So you're bringing in effectiveness, not just about prosecutions, but about everything to do with it, including understanding your risk, your supervisors of financial institutions, your designated non-financial businesses and professions, all the way through to proliferation, finance and sanctions. Right? What does your jurisdiction actually do, as opposed to what does its legislation or its processes or procedures suggest it could do? So the two parts, technical compliance looks at the rules, regulations, laws and processes, the tick box bit, as we've discussed just now, up to and including round 3 of the evaluations. And then the immediate outcomes, which is the effectiveness section. That's, as I said, the new kid on the block. It's causing some problems, as we will discuss later on, but it really does sort the wheat from the chaff to show what countries are actually doing to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. And we mustn't forget proliferation financing, because that's often a subject which is dropped off the edge when it comes to the FATF standards. One last point that needs to be emphasized is the evaluator training. Historically, there has always been a question mark raised about whether or not evaluators were the right people elected from the jurisdictions and used in the right way. Most evaluator training was like a 2-week course, and there was a lot of suspicion that various people got onto these courses, ticked the box, has 2 weeks away from the office, and a nice cushy number to relax, and are never used in an evaluation. This is because they weren't the right people. In order to look at an evaluation properly, you need somebody that understands the work area that they're being put forward as an expert in. Unfortunately, too many times that wasn't the case. My evaluator training, which took place in Washington, so I had 2 weeks away from the UK in Washington, lovely place, lovely visit. To introduce the concept of what the evaluators had to do, there was a simple test at the start. 40 questions, all based on the methodology, which anyone that's being lined up to be an evaluator, you would have assumed would have at least read. There were people on that course that didn't get 5 questions right, and they were being put forward as subject matter experts by their relevant jurisdictions. I did rather better than that before anyone heckles from the corner and asks me exactly what I got, but I did rather better than that. Now, they've reevaluated that. David Lewis and the senior FATF secretariat have got together. They've rehashed the training. They've made it clear to the jurisdictions that if they send somebody who isn't up to the job, they'll feed back that they're not up to the job and why they're not up to the job. Right? So I've got a lot more faith in the evaluators today than I did even when I did my course umpteen years ago. It's far more rigorous. The ratings themselves, as it says, there's only 4 grades: compliant, largely compliant, partially compliant, non-compliant. The other one you might see is not applicable, because on occasions it doesn't fit, recommendation doesn't fit in with the institutional features of the jurisdiction being assessed. That isn't a fault of the jurisdiction, that's just the way it goes. A lot of people see compliant, no shortcomings. Right? Sometimes you look at the finer detail and there will be 1 or 2 shortcomings, but they're so small that you can't drop it down from compliant. Largely compliant is a more common one, minor shortcomings. The last 2 are the ones that cause the problems, but we'll get onto those later on. Of particular importance when it comes to the technical compliance ratings, there's 5 recommendations. Those 5, as listed, are the ones that if any jurisdiction gets a non-compliant or partially compliant rating, right, they've got potential problems, because that has an impact much later on when it comes to what kind of follow-up process they have. But we'll discuss that in much more detail later on. What I do find interesting on this particular thing is that got R10 and R11 and R20, right, as key. What they don't have is R26, which for those that don't know off the top of their head is the regulation of supervision of financial institutions. That isn't key importance. So it is a little disturbing from my perspective that there is a focus on whether in law you're addressing customer due diligence, record keeping and reporting of suspicious activity transactions, but nobody looks at the jurisdiction's legal basis or framework for what the supervisors or the regulators are doing to ensure that financial institutions are maintaining what the laws of the land say in regards to R10, R11 and R20. I personally think that that's a bit of a failing, but I don't have the sway to change FATF just yet. Right, so immediate outcomes. 4 ratings of effectiveness and all reflect on how well the IO is achieved. High, which is achieved to a very large extent, only minor improvements needed. Unlike the technical compliance, there is not one that says no improvements are needed. I actually agree with this. It means that if you had one on there where no improvement was needed, it was basically saying that a jurisdiction could not improve their outcomes or performance. And I don't think that's possible. They might only be able to improve a short bit or a minor bit, but they would still be able to improve. Hence, there is always that comment about minor improvements are needed. You can always step one step forward. So substantial, moderate, and the one that nobody really wants, low, not achieved, or achieved to such a negligible extent, it's not really worth talking about, and fundamental improvements are needed. Rather like the technical compliance, there are some consequences for poor ratings. And in essence, unless a jurisdiction gets 3 substantial ratings, right, it has potential for really serious consequences later on. Again, we'll discuss these as we go on. Interestingly, if anyone's actually read through mutual evaluation reports, you tend to find at the back of a chapter on, for example, IO8, which is about confiscation and instrumentalities, you'll have a conclusion which will give the rating and effectiveness for that chapter. You can tend to guess what the conclusion is going to be because of the language used. And this is a tool that the FATF Secretariat use in trying to persuade the assessors to draft their report in such a fashion. So if you look at the Israel mutual evaluation report, paragraph 220, which addresses cross-border cash transaction measures. And if anyone wants to know why I know about that, it's because I actually wrote it. It states the measures applied to a very large extent. Unsurprisingly, Israel got a high rating for IO8. So the clues in the text there, to a very large extent, the measures are applied. So you can second guess what the conclusion is going to be. Right, initial preparation. These points all lead to the completion of a comprehensive jurisdictional questionnaire, but I'll start right early on. FATF offers an advisory service, if I can call it that, to the jurisdictions who are going to be subject to peer reviews. You get a couple of the Secretariat go out, have a high-level meeting with representatives of the jurisdiction, explain what the processes are, explain what the procedures are, explain what might be beneficial for the jurisdiction to start putting in place. It will underline the impact of showing effectiveness rather than just demonstrating technical compliance. It's interesting to note that there's a cut-off line for evaluations of the last day of the on-site visit. So if something isn't in place before the end of the on-site visit, it doesn't count. It doesn't matter how spectacular your proposed changes in the law are going to be. It doesn't matter how spectacular your increasing recruitment to be border force officers or supervisors, etc., is going to be. If they're not in place by the end of the on-site visit, it doesn't count. Won't even get commented upon, or shouldn't get commented upon. it will stress the engagement with all the interested parties in the jurisdiction. Private sector, public sector, trade representatives, international partners are just as critical, because there's a number of different elements within the standards that rely on your interaction with international partners. That's law enforcement partners as well as supervisory partners. All of that is really critical. And it will underline again that the jurisdiction just has to show what has been done, why it was done, who did it or does it, and importantly, what the result has been. Number of jurisdictions will quite happily show what they do, but without showing what the result is, which is quite meaningless, really. The problem with all of this, and no matter how well-meaning the FATF advisory team is, because they are really good and competent, if a jurisdiction sits on its hands and waits for the FATF officers to arrive and explain all of this, I would suggest it's already too late. The ship has sailed and you are risking a poor mutual evaluation report, because it takes a huge amount of activity to prepare a jurisdiction to get all its facts and figures, particularly in relation to effectiveness, up and together. If you look at the OECD's bribery and corruption investigations, I know we're talking about bribery and corruption investigations, they're not money laundering, but the complexity of high-level bribery and corruption investigations mirrors that of complex international money laundering investigations. OECD stats think that the average investigation to prosecution time globally is 7 years. A money laundering investigation, which is also complex and involves multiple jurisdictions, is going to take multiple years. That's to get it to the point of prosecution. Never mind prosecuting it and then going through the appeals process and going through a confiscation process and everything else. The advisory team will normally visit 2 years or so before the on-site visit. So if you're a jurisdiction and waiting to be told what to prepare and the service visit, you've already missed the boat, which is why a few jurisdictions have a few problems. The on-site visit itself, take one step back, sorry. The initial preparation goes to completing a questionnaire. It's a jurisdictional questionnaire. It's a gigantic document. It's not a 5-page multiple choice, do you have a law against anti-money laundering tick, right? It goes into detail, it gets you to explain the detail, it gets you to explain the processes and procedures and framework, and it gets you to explain what outcomes and outputs you've delivered from the implementation of that legislation. It's a huge piece of work, many hundreds of pages, invariably has dozens and dozens of attachments or annexes. Israel, by way of an example, because I know that one intimately, their questionnaire was several hundred pages long, and the attachments that they had to send to the assessment team, there was over 75 attachments, none of which were one-page wonders. It's a huge amount of work, takes a huge amount of time to build and put together. Once that's sent in, the assessment team start reviewing the jurisdictional questionnaire and pull together like a desk-based assessment. From that, they'll have a draft set of technical compliance responses, and from that, they'll be able to pull together a series of concerns that the assessment team has had, which will be put together on what's known as a scoping note. Now, the scoping note, when you come to the on-site visit, it's never more than a fortnight, and you don't get much time off. Right? It's a fortnight of work, to be perfectly frank. But because there's only a fortnight to go over the entire jurisdiction's outputs, the on-site team try and narrow it down with a scoping note. And it's the areas of concern or the areas that they would like to focus on because they want to probe and question. The role of the senior FATF secretariat, and on cases that I've worked on, there's been 2 other members of the secretariat there as well, has been critical in supporting the peer reviewers in language, in looking at the definitions and the finer details and historic conclusions of plenaries. That's one thing that most on-site assessors aren't aware of because they haven't been to all the previous plenaries. They aren't aware of the conclusions and the overall thought process that plenary brings to a evaluation report. Now, it's really important that the Senior FATF Secretariat influence the peer reviewers in that, because it saves everyone a lot of time. In my experience, they've been absolutely invaluable in bringing their knowledge of the standards and that historical significance to bear on any mutual evaluation I'm contributing to. The rules of engagement are quite funny, because when you go to the training, right, they don't any longer, but they did focus on what I call the round table, the meeting of senior officials to talk about what was in the questionnaire and what's in the scoping note. But that isn't the role of an assessor in my book, right? And this is where there were some problems, I think, to begin with, on the one that I started with in Israel. Not the Israelis' fault, I hasten to add. This isn't a punch at them. Because I see the role as one to probe and question, and to ensure that the material that's being put forward by the jurisdiction is accurate. Now, that isn't suggesting the jurisdiction's lying, right? But as everyone will know, statistics, what's the saying, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. So you can make statistics talk however you wish them to talk. And part of the assessor's job is to ensure that those statistics are unraveled so that the plenary, the group of all the FATF nations, can actually understand what the outputs and outcomes are when it comes to the effectiveness side. So when you come to a round table of top brass, of senior officials, they will toe out the party lines. That's great, but a lot of the time you want to separate top brass from practitioners. You want to separate the private sector from the supervisor. If I wanted to talk about effectiveness of cross-border cash seizures, sat around a table wasn't good enough for me. So I asked to go to a border crossing to see how the staff at the sharp end actually did it. At that point, so I was told, nobody had ever asked to leave the round table and actually go and see it in practice. The Israeli contingent were more than happy for me to do so, so long as I didn't choose the Gaza crossing point. And given the political situation at that point, Gaza was not the place I wanted to be anyway. So we went to see a crossing point, and I spent half a day talking to the people that actually did the job. Now, because that's my background expertise, I can understand what they're actually saying, and I can see any holes in the story they're giving me. As it happened, there weren't any holes in it. It was a great day. But that illustrates the difference between having the right kind of expert practitioner looking at the right part of the mutual evaluation report to draw the conclusions that are needed for that report to make sense and for that report to be a true reflection of what's happening in the jurisdiction. Before the on-site visit finishes, there's a short initial finding statement just for the host jurisdiction. It doesn't involve any gradings or anything else like that. It's more just a statement of the initial findings, as I put there. It gives a steer to the host jurisdiction about where the report may be going. It's not an invite for the host nation to make any pleadings or anything else like that. It's a one-way delivery. The plenary process. There's a lot goes on before you actually get to the plenary, because the report itself is drafted and in quite a tight timescale and is subject to, first and foremost, discussion between the assessors in the jurisdiction and then what they call third-party peer reviewers. Because the assessment team itself is also subject to peer review by individuals who are themselves assessors from jurisdictions who did not take part in the on-site visit. That's to ensure some sort of standard quality assurance across the drafting of the report. And the third-party peer reviewers, I assure you, hold no punches. they will drill into what the assessment team's conclusions are and really push the boat out in trying to understand the conclusion that's been reached, along with the narrative that sets out what the findings were. And if there's any hole in what the findings were and what the conclusion is, even down to the language, the third-party peer reviewers will go after it. The plenary itself happens 3 times a year, and at each plenary there's generally 2 mutual evaluation reports discussed in detail. Right? Obviously that isn't happening at the moment because of the current pandemic, but this assumes that it would go back to that after everything has settled down a bit. The plenary is all week, but the actual plenary discussions is the last couple of days. The first few days of the meetings are all working groups. They do the heavy lifting for a whole range of functions, not just mutual evaluation reports, but upgrades of the actual standards. There'll be working groups on new pieces of work that are coming forward. A lot of heavy lifting is done by that, and there's an awful lot of work that gets done, some really long days. In regards to the mutual evaluation reports, the working group that does the heavy lifting, first of all, is the Evaluations and Compliance Group, the ECG. What they actually do is they circulate the draft report several weeks before the plenary. Every jurisdiction reviews it, sends in, if they have any concerns or comments, if they think that somebody's been rated too highly or too low, or they think the narrative of the findings is inconsistent with the review, they will make that point. And the ECG comes up with a whole discussion, generally half a day, right? They'll plow through everything, right? And it's at that point that the assessors are put to the test, because as an assessor, if you've rated somebody substantial on their effectiveness, and there's 3 or 4 jurisdictions that vehemently disagree, it's up to the assessor to sit in front of the entire working group and actually justify the comments. It can be a really hostile place, particularly if the evaluated jurisdiction has taken exception to something and has co-opted a couple of colleagues, because the one issue with the plenary process, that's ECG up to plenary itself, is what I call the Eurovision Song Contest voting approach. For those that are outside the European mass and don't know what the Eurovision Song Contest is, it is what it says on the tin, a song contest. However, when it comes to the voting, it's renowned for not being as straightforward as you would imagine, where just because a country has got a really great song doesn't mean it will get good points. Depends on which country was singing it and which country is voting. I don't want to go into the ins and outs of which clique of jurisdictions work together, but there are several. Right? And it is one of the issues that the plenary process has got, in my opinion. When you take into account that the process to upgrade somebody or downgrade somebody can be blocked by just 3 jurisdictions voting against. There's been some, in my opinion, woeful examples, which I won't name, right, where jurisdictions have been downgraded, right, or more to the point, jurisdictions have been upgraded by the mass, but then blocked by 3 jurisdictions who have disagreed with it. And on a number of occasions, you can clearly see it's because they don't like the jurisdiction in question, in my opinion. It's one of the hot contests of FATF, and it's one of the things that a number of people don't like about the FATF process. But we'll get to that in more detail on the wrap up. So the ratings consequences, just to put this into context, if you have 8 non-compliant or partially compliant ratings into technical compliance, any non-compliant or partially compliant for the 5 hot topics that we spoke of in the earlier slide, 4 or more low effectiveness in the immediate outcomes, or 7 low and moderate immediate outcome ratings, then you go into enhanced follow-up. I'll detail more what enhanced follow-up means in a moment. The big one is the ICRG. That's 20 plus non-compliant or partially compliant, 3 non-compliant or partially compliant in the hot 5, 9 plus low or moderates with at least 2 in immediate outcome, at least 2 low in immediate outcome ratings, or 6 or more low ratings. All of those, 1 or more triggers, you don't have to hit all the triggers, it's 1 or more of them from each category, put you in ICRG. So what does that actually mean? All right, regular follow-ups. They submit a report within 3 years of your mutual evaluation, setting out how they're progressing with any of the changes or improvements that were suggested within the mutual evaluation report. There is a follow-up assessment that takes place about 5 years after the original on-site visit. It's a much shorter one. It's only 2 or 3 days, and there'll be a huge desktop review, and it will focus on just the deficiencies or those areas that the jurisdiction has requested upgrades in technical compliance and immediate outcomes. Right? And the expectation is to address all the technical deficiencies within 3 years and the immediate outcome deficiencies prior to the 5-year follow-up. Right? So that's the regular bit. That's the bit that everyone wants to get into. That's the nice, easy answer. The enhanced follow-up, the slightly more problematic one, you've got 3 reports to be submitted before your 5-year follow-up. And in each of those reports, you need to show progress in correcting things. A jurisdiction can seek a review of technical compliance ratings at any point in those follow-ups, but it must request it. So it can put a follow-up report in without requesting. Very important to realise, and there's a little star at the bottom of the slide, that if a jurisdiction requests a re-rating at the end of one of its follow-up reports, any changes or amendments that have taken place to the FATF recommendations in the period since its original mutual evaluation report was done will be re-evaluated from a technical compliance point of view at that point. Even if the jurisdiction was previously compliant, because of the amendments, it might actually find itself only largely compliant. So jurisdictions are very mindful about that. The most obvious one is the US, right, who went into enhanced follow-up. Right, we'll discuss that in more detail shortly. Right. Their first 2 follow-up reports did not request a re-rating, only the 3rd one. And on the 3rd one, they were also reviewed for 4, I think it was 4, other recommendations that had the contents of those recommendations updated. So they were re-evaluated for those. It's important to remember that a jurisdiction cannot seek IO re-ratings at this point. Right? It's only at the 5-year follow-up bit for the on-site visit there. Just as important, it can move from enhanced to regular, and just as important, it can move from enhanced to ICRG, depending on whether or not that comes into play. I don't know of one where FATF has become aware of the fact that a country's compliance with the standards has dropped. Not saying there isn't one, but I'm not familiar with one. Yeah, that'll do. Right, ICRG, this is the big one. It's the International Cooperation Review Group. Right? This is a working group, much the same as the ECG. The decisions it makes are recommendations to the main plenary in exactly the same way as the ECG is. Neither group has the defining right on anything. It's the plenary that makes the ultimate decision. So both the ICRG and ECG can make recommendations which are subsequently overturned by the main FATF plenary group. It's otherwise known as the Grey and Blacklist Forum. It covers both sections. There's 18 jurisdictions currently on the increased monitoring, that's the grey list, and 2 on the high-risk jurisdictions, otherwise known as the blacklist. With regard to Iran, they were, until February 2020, halfway between the grey list and the blacklist. It was a weird set of circumstances where FATF deemed them fit for listing on the high-risk jurisdictions, but because of the issues in Iran with the social and economic issues that would have implied there, they suspended the full impact of the countermeasures that normally come into play when you hit a high-risk jurisdiction. The countermeasures are increased customer due diligence, deeper audit processes, higher degree of sanctions capability, and that kind of thing. However, Iran singularly failed to do any work on its action plans, and we'll talk about action plans from there, between June 2016 and January 2018, when its action plan timeline expired. And despite repeated requests, close to demands from FATF, right, it did nothing until February 2020, when FATF finally lost its patience and suspended the suspension of the countermeasures. So you've now got 2 jurisdictions on the blacklist. As I said, it's the action plans that are considered, and action plans are designed to address the worst deficiencies. Each jurisdiction on this list, on the increased monitoring list, must provide a report for every plenary, so it's every 4 months, until such times that they're actually amended or improved, and they can work themselves off the ICRG working group up to the next level, which is just enhanced, as we spoke of earlier. All the time, it's a consideration about whether or not additional inducements or encouragement is needed to apply the FATF standards. So if a jurisdiction is on the increased monitoring and fails, rather like Iran, or the other one of hot debate at the moment is Pakistan, right, fails to deliver significant progress, right, it moves further up to the blacklist. But we'll see how things go with Pakistan, because again, that is one that is subject to the Eurovision Song Contest voting principles. So, wrap up. Is it all worth it? There's an awful lot of time, money and effort that goes into mutual evaluations. One of the things I would suggest is whether or not the big players are actually playing ball, and this is personal view. You take the presidency, for example. Recent presidents of FATF have come from the USA, and the current one is China. Now, if you look at their mutual evaluation reports, there are huge chunks of their own that didn't meet standards, to the point that both of them are in enhanced follow-up. And these are jurisdictions that are holding the presidency of FATF. You look at the technical compliance of China, and I've got the stats here, excuse me while I look down to check them. There was 7 compliant, 15 largely compliant, 12 partially compliant, and 6 non-compliant. That, to my mind, isn't really good enough for somebody that's holding the presidency of FATF. The US didn't do a huge amount better. They had 4 non-compliant. And interestingly, there are similarities between the US and China, that it's the DNFBP area where most of the non-compliant section comes in. There are also areas where people, sorry, not people, jurisdictions are struggling to adhere to the standards. So if you look at immediate outcomes 3 to 5, no member has ever secured a high rating on those immediate outcomes, ever. That's more than 100 evaluations that have taken place, and not a single jurisdiction has scored high on IOs 3 to 5 inclusive, ever. I find that rather worrying. The best score at the moment is Spain, that has got substantial on all 3, but only after its follow-up assessment, where it's successfully got one of them upgraded from M to S. If you look at the other immediate outcomes, and we're focusing on effectiveness now, IO1, there's only 2 jurisdictions that have got a high there, the UK and Bermuda. Australia, Finland and Sweden are the only 3 jurisdictions to get a high on IO2. IO6, Israel, Russia, and Spain. IO8, Israel, USA, and Honduras. Don't know about Honduras on confiscation, which is IO8. But IO9 is Israel, Russia, UK, and the US. And 10 and 11, it's the US and UK. People have been trumpeting the UK's mutual evaluation report, and we did well. People query about whether we did score correctly. I'm not entering into that. The one thing I would say is that the number of highs we got are across sectors that we've got a degree of extra interest in. So you're looking at terrorism, the same as the USA. Terrorism was its high one. They also scored high in the confiscation bit, but if you look at the standards, that includes confiscation of the proceeds of crime in whatever format. It's not just confiscation as in conviction-based asset recovery, it's all forms. So if you look at the SEC fines and the hundreds of millions for not having anti-money laundering procedures correct, those were included. So you've got to read the statistics properly. There is debate about whether or not that is all worth it. However, on the flip side, if you look at Bermuda, what did Bermuda do from its outcome? It got 28 technical compliance, compliant ratings, 28, largely compliant, 11, partially compliant, 1, non-compliant, none. That is better than the UK. That's the best there's been, to my knowledge. The only one, the partially compliant, was on cross-border cash controls. The reason it did so well is because it actually took the time and effort to prepare for this. It started its preparations for the 4th round. Right? The week after, it concluded the 3rd round. It didn't take a huge amount of effort. Well, sorry, I correct myself there. Didn't take a huge amount of resource. It took a huge amount of effort. Right? It had a couple of people monitoring everything as developments unfolded on the 4th round. And every time something new happened, they took it on board, they adapted, they planned for it. They started collecting stats. They started looking at what their jurisdiction was doing, who was doing it, when they were doing it, why they were doing it. And they started making their preparation years before the advisory team even thought about doing a visit. That's why Bermuda did as well as it did. On the effectiveness bit, just so we're painting the complete picture, it had 1 high, understanding its risk, 6 substantials, 3 moderates, and only 1 low, and that was on confiscation. So it did do well. Moving on from the wrap-up bit, the cash controls, supervision and regulation, and stopping people putting the proceeds of crime into systems and abusing the financial system. Does it work? Does it stop people from actually money laundering? I'm not entirely certain it stops them dead. However, if you look at the other extreme, you go to Vanuatu, who got absolutely carpeted in October 15 on their technical side, where they had just 1 compliant, 9 largely compliant, 17 partially compliant, and 13 non-compliant. They've turned the boat around. They've now got 18 compliant, 21 largely compliant, and only 1 partially compliant. I accept that's the rule book, that's the tick the box bit, you know, and we're a long way from having the effectiveness raised, which, to be clear, were all low. But they've managed to put, at least on the tick box, on the statute, on the framework in place. They've turned it around. And if that makes it more difficult for people to launder money, right, I think it does actually serve a purpose. And at the end of the day, when you get the likes of the USA, China, the UK, the EU, Russia, Australia, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Israel, South Africa, all of whom have got a huge range of different ideologies and political directions and internal beliefs, but they're all in the same room, all talking about the same topic, all trying to make the landscape harder for money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. It's got to be a step in the right direction. Is it perfect? No, I don't think it is. Is it the best we can do at the moment? Possibly. You never know, with the current pandemic, perhaps doors will open that will get people more encouraged to enter into dialogue about things that are more uncomfortable, but we shall see. But overall, I think it is worth it. It is a pain in the arse, excuse my French, but it does serve a purpose and it does move people in the right direction. For anyone that gets these slides later on, there's some links there that you might find useful. And lastly, I'll move to questions, for which I've noticed from my little board, there are quite a few coming in.
Yes, we've certainly had a lot of questions through the webinar. If anyone else does want to send in any more questions whilst we do the Q&A, please feel free to. Richard, if it's okay, we can start the Q&A.
Yeah, I'll go to the first one on my drop down if you like. The question is, as I don't know if everyone can see this, so I'll read it out so everyone can be aware. As effectiveness is part of the FATF evaluation, surely the UK should be judged more harshly given the very low recovery of laundered funds. I understand why the question's been asked. There were quite clearly some eyebrows raised. There's a couple of issues. One is the actual recovery of laundered funds itself is an element. It's not the element, it's an element in IO8. And when people pick up the methodology, they very quickly look at the immediate outcomes and they look at the set of questions there. But what they tend not to do is look at the characteristics. And an assessor must ask those questions, but it's not necessarily the questions that guide you to the result of what the rating is going to be, because it's the characteristics, the narrative within the IO8 characteristics that actually scores the points. That's what you're judging people by. Yes, I think we ought to do better. I'm not excusing the UK's recovery stats. One thing I do think that is missed, particularly when you're talking about confiscation, which is a pet subject of mine, is that very quickly we look at somebody that's committed a fraud, by way of an example, and they've stolen £10 million. They've lived the life of Riley and there's only £2 million left. The confiscation order, right, unless they can satisfy the court that they have not hidden that, will be for 10 million, even though they've actually spent 8 million. And it's very difficult to prove that you don't have something. Very difficult to prove a negative. So, and I use a really obvious one there, but there's a large number of instances within the UK criminal justice system where people have got confiscation orders where it's simply not going to be collected, ever. And the benefit from the crime is never going to be the amount recovered. And there's lots of graphs and commentary that says that only, was it 3p in the pound of criminal proceeds are recovered? That's the benefit from crime, not what's available to be recovered, and they're two completely different things. But I do think we could do better. Hopefully that answers that question. Another question, a great deal more guidance could be issued on how to search thoroughly for adverse information rather than just using a few statistic databases in Google. Why hasn't such guidance been issued? I'm going to use a cricket bat and bat that one away to FATF. I would suggest that that is one of the sorts of questions that the working groups that I referred to earlier should be looking through to see whether or not that kind of guidance and suggestion should be in footnotes for customer due diligence for one of the recommendations, or embedded in perhaps recommendation 29, which is about financial intelligence units, or it could be in some context, some subsector of recommendation 20, which is about suspicious activity reports. There's a number of different places it could be parachuted to encourage people to take into a wider data stream about what might impact on whether something is suspicious, whether it is money laundering or terrorist financing. I couldn't actually tell you why that's not been issued yet. Another question. It's the same questioner. Somebody's been busy. Do you think a pan-European AML regulator, the EU is now consulting on this, is likely to make an AML CFT activities more effective? My quick answer to that is it could. I know that sounds like I'm sitting on the fence, but it really does depend on what powers that EU-wide regulator is given and what access to the information in the EU member states it has, and whether or not it has the ability to force the material to be provided, whether or not data protection causes problems, whether or not they're then able to, I mean, if the new EU regulator, whatever format it takes, then decides to disseminate intelligence, is that going to be a breach? We already have plenty of problems for a bank in the UK that has a branch in the US. The bank itself talks to each side of each jurisdiction to understand what the other one's doing, but the UK bank can't tell the UK authorities what the US bank knows. Now, if you take that to the EU side, there's a whole host of questions there. It has the potential to make it more effective. I think it has the potential to make it more coordinated and responsive and to look for patterns and trends. Whether or not it's given the right powers, I don't know. I think that's a wait and see job. Next question. RegTechs with technology which could reduce financial crime are struggling because banks often only buy such tech when they may think they may be fined. How can this situation be improved? Wow. My instant response to that would be increase the size of the fines, and you are likely to get people spending more money to be compliant as far as they can see, which will reduce the fines, so they invest sooner rather than being forced to invest later. But that's a big risk one. That's a calculated risk by the banks, and I would hazard to suggest it's not only banks. There's a number of other financial institutions, not just banks. And it's really a commercial decision on them. Do they want to risk the fines or not? Not helped by the fact that, of course, that the people in charge don't pay the fine more often than not. It's the shareholders. So you could make the people in charge of the organizations more liable. That may change their commercial appetite for getting materials and tools in that would assist them in reducing financial crime. Yes, the slides will be provided. Somebody's asked about that. And I believe this is also being recorded, and I believe that's going to be on LinkedIn as well. Another question, do I have any observations on the UK Law Commissioner's report on the SAR regime and the effectiveness of the UK FIU, thinking about the MER comments? Yes, there's no secret. I used to work with the NCA. I know a lot of people in the FIU. They work really hard. They are struggling with insufficient IT, I think is the best way to put it. There's a lot of material that's put in to the systems. Some of it is back covering by reporting entities that doesn't need to go in. But I do think that the UK could make better use of its SARS regime. There's a number of different ways it could be done. I'm not entirely convinced the Law Commission's report on the direction of travel is necessarily going to be the right one. It is rather like the European-wide AML supervisor, down to the finesse of what powers are going to be available, what requests are going to be made of reporting entities, and what tools and kit is going to be made available, not only to the FIU, but the people that access the SARS database from the different law enforcement agencies, potentially the supervisors as well, to gain the opportunity to make the full use of the entire database. So it's definitely got some progress to be made, because it's nowhere near as effective as it could be. Particularly when you look at strategic analysis. We as a jurisdiction probably don't do enough of that as we ought to. Different law enforcement agencies tap into the SARS regime to look at specific cases and make some fantastic progress on specific cases, don't get me wrong, but expecting an individual law enforcement agency to do strategic work, I think is unrealistic. So from that perspective, I think there is a lot of work to do. I hope that answers the question.
Perfect. Thank you.
I think I've answered everything.
You have actually. Could I ask a question myself?
Oh, only if it's not a difficult one.
So the purpose, obviously, of an FATF mutual evaluation is to assess the strength and effectiveness of a country's AML CFT regime.
Yep.
As we see the regulated sectors, so the UK government law enforcement, become more holistic and joined up across other FC factors such as sanctions, fraud, anti-bribery, do you see a time when the FATF will broaden and deepen its scope of mutual evaluations?
Sorry, I missed it. Broaden itself into what, sorry?
If it will broaden and deepen its scope of mutual evaluations?
My personal viewpoint, I would be reluctant for it to do that. I think it's got a huge amount on its plate already. Undoubtedly, there'll be various corners that would welcome that sort of thing. But I think to keep on top of what it's currently got, given the world that we're living in, I think it's got enough on its plate already. And I hope it doesn't. Although I can see, as I said, some people pushing towards it. But when you already consider what it's got on its plate, and you've got people, the big players like China and the USA, struggling to meet the standards that are set out in a mutual evaluation report, where they can only secure an enhanced follow-up regime. And yet you've got players like Ireland and Portugal who managed to come out and go straight into regular. Far smaller jurisdictions, far less resources, and yet they've managed to put a set of technical compliance and effectiveness performance together that puts them in regular. I mean, Ireland didn't get a high on anything, but it didn't get a low on anything. It got 6 substantials and 5 moderates. You could say it's only a moderate. You could make leaps of progress and become far better. But the point is, it's still producing an effective outcome when it comes to the standards. And there are so few that go straight to regular. Most jurisdictions go to enhanced. So I think FATF and everything it stands for, huge amount of work still to do. And of course, when you look at things like virtual assets and all the changes to the standards that are still being made as a result of that, the scope of its activity is going to be ever changing, just keeping with the title of what it's got on scope at the moment. So I think it's got its hands full already. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you very much. So I do believe that is the end of our Q&A session for today. Thank you to everyone who has attended this afternoon's session, as well as Richard for generously hosting the webinar. So I'd probably say until next time, thank you all for joining and keep safe.
Thank you all. Take care. And as Lauren said, stay safe.